In the year 1795, Poland was partitioned for the third and final time between the powers of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, wiping Poland off the map seemingly forever. But coming into the 1900s, a golden opportunity arose for the Poles to re-establish their country once and for all. When war broke out in 1914, over 3.5 million Poles were recruited into the Russian, German, and Austrian armies, and in many instances were pitted against each other. Despite that, many Poles served their respective overlords loyally, believing that they could somehow advance their own national agenda. The most active Polish political camp was in Austria. Former socialist activist and proud Polish patriot Józef Pilsudski fought on behalf of Austria, crossing into Russian-occupied Poland to try and foment an anti-Russian uprising. While this never came to fruition, the Poles still contributed by sending legions of volunteers to the Austrian war effort. The Austrian Poles had hoped that by serving Austria, they could unite Austrian Galicia with the rest of Russian-occupied Poland. To an extent, these hopes came true, as the Central Powers slowly pushed the Russians out of Poland and captured the capital of Warsaw. After the Russian Revolution, the new provisional government even declared itself in favor of Polish independence, which really didn't mean much, but it was a step closer towards freedom. Prior that same year, Austria and Germany then established the Kingdom of Poland, and a temporary council of state was appointed under the watchful eye of the Central Powers. Unfortunately for the Poles, the Central Powers were unwilling to grant them full independence, and relations between both sides only deteriorated as the war went on, even resulting in the arrest of Józef Pilsudski for his anti-German stance. When the Central Powers handed over the city of Kelmo to the Ukrainian People's Republic, a series of riots broke out in occupied Poland, and several Polish units in Central Powers service defected to the Russians. The tide of war also began to change, as the Allied powers grew increasingly stronger, while the Central Powers grew closer to collapse. Luckily for the Poles, the Allied powers were quite sympathetic to their cause. In his 14 points, US President Woodrow Wilson emphasized that an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited indisputably by Polish populations, which should be assured free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant. With the defeat of the Central Powers and the collapse of Russia, Poland was finally able to carve up an independent state of her own. Another positive consequence of the Great War was that Poland now had millions of men with military experience and plenty of guns to equip a new army. On the downside, ethnic lines between the Poles and their neighbors were rather messy, and this would lead to wars with Ukraine, Lithuania, and, what is the subject of this video, Germany. In the region called Greater Poland, within it, the city of Poznan, still occupied by the Germans, a Polish uprising commenced on the 27th of December 1918 after the arrival of a Polish musician named Ignacy Jan Paderewski, who encouraged the Polish population to revolt. What was initially a spontaneous event gradually organized itself into a serious threat for Germany's eastern border. A huge player in this uprising was the Polish Military Organization, or POW after its initials in Polish, founded by Józef Pilsudski as a semi-clandestine army that committed acts of espionage and sabotage against the enemies of Poland. In support of the POW were several civilian militias, the first being the Citizens Guard, formed in the city of Poznan, and the second being the People's Guard, operating in the countryside. The Polish army itself was also involved, sending the 11th Infantry Regiment in support of the uprising. On the other side of the coin, we have the Germans. Things were incredibly difficult for the once proud German army, exhausted from its defeat in World War I and tied down with the Spartacus uprising in other parts of the country. A colorful team of at least 14 different Freikorps units, 3 regiments of Marines, Infantry, and Grenadiers from the Reichswehr, the hastily organized Eastern Border Guard, and lastly, several self-defense battalions made up of reservists. In total, the Poles brought forth 22,000 troops, and the Germans 21,000. While the German troops were, on average, better trained and equipped, the Poles were quick to take the initiative. On the first day of the uprising, 100 Polish troops seized key points in Poznan such as the telegraph office and railway station. They then laid siege to the citadel and the Grobman fortress defended by the German 6th Grenadier Regiment. The next day, Poznan had fallen to the Poles after the Germans had retreated and other armed groups all over the region had risen up, seizing even more ground. In the next 2 days, over a dozen towns had been captured by the Poles. The Freikorps tried their best to hold their ground, but were ultimately pushed back. They successfully continued to advance throughout the week, but on the 7th of January 1919, the Germans saw some brief success after capturing a few towns, only for the Poles to counterattack and retake them. The Polish Air Force even launched a raid on the city of Frankfurt, though it didn't inflict much damage. The tide then turned against the Poles when, on the 7th, two Freikorps units commanded by Nicholas von Bello and Kurt von der Born launched two simultaneous attacks in the north and the south. After this, land constantly changed hands between the Germans and the Poles without either side getting any real advantage over the other. By the end of January, the Polish government held secret negotiations with the Weimar Republic to put an end to the fighting. However, both sides were unwilling to compromise and demanded that the other disarm their militias. The fighting continued, and the Germans saw some brief success on part of the front thanks to the support of an armored train, but elsewhere they failed to seize any more ground. With no side gaining any real advantage over the other, both sides decided to bring the fighting to an end. On the 16th of February, Germany and Poland signed a ceasefire in the German city of Trier. The Greater Poland region was incorporated into the Second Polish Republic, while the Germans had no other choice but to give up hopes on reconquering their lost territory. But the question still remained on what was to happen with the other German territories with large Polish populations. Article 88 of the Treaty of Versailles demanded that referendums be held in the region of Upper Silesia under the supervision of the Allies. The build-up to this referendum was marked by tension and violence. There were irregularities on both sides, with the Poles expelling their German minority from civil administration, banning German symbols from public spaces, and restricting the German language. The Germans, on the other hand, responded with violence against their own Polish minority. The French strongly backed the Poles, wanting to give them Upper Silesia without a referendum taking place. The reason being is that the French were greatly concerned with weakening Germany and preventing her from ever becoming a threat again. Supporting Poland was just one way to achieve this objective. Britain, on the other hand, was less resentful against the Germans as they had already achieved their goal of destroying Germany's navy and eliminating their overseas empire. Post-war relations with France had taken a downward spiral, and the two became rivals. Therefore, a strong Poland would mostly benefit France at the expense of Britain. Upper Silesia was divided between the German-populated cities and the Polish-populated countryside. In the build-up to the referendum, violence would once again break out between the two groups. On the 15th of August, 1919, the first of the Silesian Uprisings commenced when German border guards shot at civilians on the Polish side of the border at a disputed mine, killing 10 people. 140,000 Poles within the German side then went on strike in protest. They were then joined by the Polish military organization, attacking several towns in the area. Unlike during the Poznan uprising, the German military responded swiftly and brutally, with the uprising being quickly suppressed. 2,500 Polish rebels were then publicly executed, and 9,000 more were forced into exile. The response of the international community was to finally send a military force to the area, comprised of French, British, and Italian troops, totaling 15,000 men. The peace was only held together for a year, when on the 19th of August, 1920, as the Battle of Warsaw was occurring, the Poles once again revolted. What kicked off the Second Silesian Uprising was a false rumor that the Soviets had defeated the Polish army, making the German population believe that they could reintegrate with the rest of Germany without the referendum. German rioters then began to attack Poles and Polish property, but all this did was favor the Polish military organization in rallying support for their own rebellion. The Poles seized control of several towns and, on the 20th, had started to attack German military installations. The Poles probably could have taken even more territory had it not been for the intervention of the French army, who forced both sides to return to their original positions. However, the Poles did succeed in getting the German police force replaced by a joint Polish-German one. Finally, on the 20th of March, 1921, the long-awaited plebiscite took place, though its results were rather disappointing for the Poles. 706,000 people voted in favor of reintegrating with Germany, and 479,000 voted to join Poland. However, the vote was not proportionate to the whole of Silesia, with the southeastern part of the region favoring Poland and the rest favoring Germany. Obviously, not content with the results, the Polish population went on strike on the 2nd of May. The protest quickly turned into another armed rebellion, being given plenty of support from the Polish government. The Polish forces totaled 40,000 troops, growing quickly to 46,000. The Polish army even managed to supply the insurgents with weapons via secret routes, indicating that measures had been taken to seize the region even if they had lost the plebiscite. By the second day of the uprising, most of the region had come under control of the rebels, and several Polish army battalions crossed the border supported by armored trains. The German government protested, but was essentially a Polish invasion to the international community. While Britain and Italy backed the Germans, the French stood alongside their Polish allies and even threatened to invade the Ruhr Valley. With no meaningful support, the Germans mobilized their forces to fight back the Poles. The Freikorps and Eastern Border Guards confronted the Poles in multiple directions. The international force in Silesia was caught in between the two warring sides. The Italian contingent came under attack from a Polish offensive that killed and wounded 250 Italian troops. On the 21st of May, 900 German soldiers supported by artillery commenced an attack on the Polish-held Annaberg Monastery, strategically located on top of a hill, meaning that it would be a hard fight to capture it. The Battle of Annaberg was characterized by ruthless fighting, and neither side took prisoners. In the case that they did, the unfortunate souls were often executed. By the end of the first day, the Germans had successfully captured the monastery and began digging in for the inevitable Polish counterattack. During the next 2 days, the Poles launched attack after attack on the monastery and the surrounding German positions. It wasn't until the 26th that the Poles called it quits after suffering 120 casualties and gave up all attempts at capturing the monastery, even abandoning the surrounding area. Fighting continued into the first few days of June until the Allied forces finally forced both sides to disarm. Poland was forced to recognize the results of the referendum and gave up hopes on annexing most of Upper Silesia. But it wasn't all bad for them. The southeastern part, mostly inhabited by Poles, was allowed to separate from the rest of Silesia and join Poland. This area held 3/4 of the region's coal production and close to 2/3 of its steelworks. However, tensions between Germany and Poland remained. According to the 1925 census, there were 784,000 Poles living within Germany, most of them in Upper Silesia, though some estimates from the period claim that there could possibly be 1.7 million. On the other side, there are about 1 million Germans living in Poland on the eve of World War II. There was also the issue of the Polish corridor and the free city of Danzig, which left the Germans with a lot to be desired. Since Hitler was a sore loser, he used these issues to, in part, justify his invasion of Poland during World War II. Once reconquered, the Germans began to kill and deport thousands of Poles living in Silesia, replacing them with German settlers. In an ironic twist, Poland, accompanied by the Soviets, did much of the same when they pushed out the Germans. After the rearrangement of Eastern Europe's ethnic borders post-World War II, Upper Silesia and many other former German territories were now firmly in the hands of God's second favorite country. Relations between the two states have since improved, and the war for Silesia has finally come to an end. This video was brought to you by Real Polish Patriots. If you want to see more content like this, you can subscribe or even donate to my Ko-fi page to help fund Polish propaganda. Thanks for watching, and till next time.